Hey YouTube, Alex here, and in today's video I want to talk about your long-term travel goals and also your interest in dating abroad. So a lot of the guys I talk to, they're interested in living abroad in part to date, but they also so a lot of the guys I talk to, they're interested in living abroad in part to date, and a lot of them also want to travel. And so I wanted to make this video kind of discussing some of the things that might come up when you go about working on this plan. So for some countries, people have a strong passport and they can easily visit a lot of different countries. That was something that was cool about seeing this chick here in Peru, is with their visa, with their passport, they can visit I think 130 or so countries visa on arrival. And this is quite different from somewhere like, say, the Philippines, where they do need a visa for many countries, and alongside that, it can be quite challenging to exit the Philippines with your Filipina or Filipino partner, especially Filipina, because there are issues with different kinds of crimes related to that, and that's something that you can do research on. But the government, even though the person that you're looking to take with you is an adult, has a passport, is legally allowed to do what they're doing, then you might find that you're having to jump through all these extra hoops, and you could still be denied at the airport just because you didn't satisfy whatever requirements they have. So if you're somebody that you want to perhaps get in a relationship with somebody, find a long-term partner, perhaps a spouse in another country, then that's something that you need to keep in mind, that if you also have travel goals, you're going to have to do some compromises depending on the country that your partner is from, depending on their passport. It varies by country, and that's going to take certainly unique research to pull off effectively. But it's something to consider, that if you think, okay, I'll go live in the Philippines for a year, in that time I'll find a nice partner, and then at the end of that year we'll start visiting other countries. Well, in many cases it could be really challenging to do so. Now, I'm not saying specifically to pick a country based on the strength of their passport as far as where you're interested in finding a partner. I think that there's a lot of other things that go into finding a partner that you should consider, but definitely you don't want to get ahead of yourself and attempt to make plans with them, realizing that you can't really pull off those plans in the way that you initially anticipated. So yeah, it just gets to be a bit tricky, I think, when you think about the visa issues. Of course, some countries that you might be interested in dating somebody, their visa could... So the visa situation is the first thing you really need to think about if you're trying to mix the idea of dating somebody in another country and then later on traveling with that person. It's quite a bit different than, say, dating them and staying in that country. And yeah, I thought I'd just get into this. I know several of you guys have asked me about dating in other countries, and I wanted to combine that with something else that is the focus of this channel. This should be obvious, and maybe I should have mentioned it first, but you also should consider that your partner may have different travel goals or different attitudes, different mindset toward travel than you do. Perhaps they're not interested in traveling in, for example, the United States. Maybe you're from the US and you'd like to show your partner more of the US, but in some cases they're not interested. If you look at, for example, Mark of Every Man Has a Story, shout out to Mark, wonderful channel. His girlfriend, I'm not mistaken, has mentioned him. She doesn't really have a lot of interest in traveling in the US. It's just not something that she wants to do. You may also find that the person that you're dating, maybe they have a sick family that they're taking care of, maybe they have some younger siblings that they help with looking out after. Even though you as a single guy or gal may have no impediments or minimal impediments to your travel plans, and in fact the person that you're seeing, it may be such that they can't really go abroad, and then you might be faced with a difficult decision. Do you stay in their country, which you may very well love, but you may have to sacrifice going to some of the other places that you want to go with them. Maybe you have some kind of arrangement where part of the year you travel, or maybe a month or something, but that's something that you really need to consider when it comes to dating in another country. The next thing that some of you may feel is obvious, but it's going to be budget. Depending on where they're coming from, and if they're coming from a country that is not perhaps as economically powerful as the US, they may not have the money to travel. You may be in a situation where you need to increase your budget significantly to cover the cost of them traveling with you, whether it be larger, more luxurious accommodation. Perhaps, instead of paying for food for one person, you're now paying for two, drinks, excursions, flights, activities. All of these things aren't going to necessarily be 2x, but you can imagine you will be spending more if you're traveling with a partner that perhaps doesn't have a ton of their own money and resources to meet you halfway. The next thing I'm going to mention here, and I'm not going to harp too much on this point, it's not really within the scope of this video, but keep in mind too that you may want to stay and they may want to leave. That's been a common thing with the women that I've dated in a variety of countries. Is I have an interest in living in their country long term, and they're interested in perhaps living in the United States or some other country, and that's not really something that I want to compromise with long term. Something kind of superficial, but you may prefer mountains. You may prefer countries like Peru, Georgia, Nepal, and they may be more of a beach person. They may prefer spending time in the Philippines. They may prefer spending time in Mexico. Not to say Mexico doesn't have mountains, Philippines doesn't have mountains, but certainly they're different. The next thing to consider is that you may prefer budget travel. You may prefer being kind of a bit more economical, choosing more modest accommodation, perhaps choosing more street food over restaurant food. And they may be the exact opposite. They may prefer dining exclusively in restaurants. They may have a minimum standard as far as hotels that they want to stay at that could be quite different from your preferences. So the next thing to consider is that when you are traveling with two people, different kinds of things that come up may cost you twice as much. For example, if you are late to the airport and perhaps you missed your flight, well, you're no longer paying to rebook a single flight. You may be booking for two flights. If, for example, you guys miss the last public transit option for the evening and you need to go private, you're not paying for one, you're paying for two. And while it's often economical to do a lot of these things abroad, consider that paying for something twice could really change the economics of your long-term travel plans. The next thing goes into budget somewhat, but you may be the type of person that you like to stay in a certain place for a month at a time. That's how I like to travel. That's how Vagabond Awake likes to travel. Shout out to Vagabond Awake. And I find that this pace allows me to be more economical. I'm not paying for flights every week, for example. But if you're with somebody that likes to set a faster pace, that wants to be country hopping every week or every few weeks, then that's going to really cause some pressure and some stress. And so a lot of these things I'm mentioning you should really discuss prior to leaving and kind of be on a solid plan. If you are dating somebody in another country and you want to travel with them, definitely don't overlook these things. Understand that really they can come up, and you'd be surprised at what kind of things come up when you are traveling abroad outside of your home country. I think part of what I'm getting at here too is don't necessarily try to push what you want to do or how you want to do it on somebody else. Try to find somebody that shares some of those same interests, similar mindset, way of doing things, has a similar attitude toward budget, finances, timeline, all of these things. But I'm going to keep rolling with this one. The next one's going to be partying, and I think that this can come into play somewhat when you're dating somebody that is a bit younger than you. For me, for example, I'm in my late 20s. I prefer to date women in their early to mid 20s, and at times we have different attitudes toward partying. For me, I'm cool with partying maybe once a month or with less frequency, but some of them, depending on where they're at in life, they may want to party every week, every weekend. And if you're somebody that's not really much of a bar hopper, then you might find yourself kind of burnt out and tired of that lifestyle, but because you're at a different point in life than them, they're ready to go and they want to keep partying. And so you have to really assess that aspect of your long-term travel, because it can be really easy to develop poor habits when you're out of your comfort zone. The next thing I'm going to mention, you may find that the stress of travel changes the dynamic of your relationship. You may change as people. I know, as an example, a channel I'm a fan of, Simon and Martina, they lived in, I think, Korea for 8 years, and they lived in Japan for a couple years. They're both from Toronto, Canada, but I think that they ultimately ended up being separated. Really unfortunate. I'm not at all trying to pick on them, but they found, I think, that after a decade of travel, they'd become different people. They'd grown in different ways. They'd developed different ideas or attitudes or mindsets toward different things, and they found that they weren't as compatible. So that's something you have to consider when you are planning a long-term travel with a significant other that you met in another country, that you may think, oh, well, they're this way because they're always going to be this way because that's what they grew up in and that's what they're used to. But travel exposes people to a lot of different things, and not all of that is positive, and not all of that is good for relationships or growing as a couple. The final thing I'm going to mention here is that you may want to slow down at some point. You may feel like, well, we've traveled for several years. I'm ready to go back and live in the country where I met you. And they may feel like, well, I'm enjoying traveling. I like going to different places. I like going to new places. I'm not necessarily looking to settle down. And that could be problematic. So I hope this video has been helpful. This video, I've talked about some of the pitfalls that can come up when you're both dating somebody in another country and looking to make travel plans with them. You really ought to consider the financials of the situation. You ought to consider the logistics. Could be a visa issue, could be a money issue. A lot of things can come up. I don't want to discourage you or dissuade you, but just kind of give you some ideas of how to prepare if you find yourself several years from now in a relationship with somebody that's in another country and trying to continue the travel lifestyle that many of us love. So thank you so much for watching. Definitely give us a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Comment down below. Let me know what you think. I love the discussion that we've been able to have and continue. And finally, subscribe if you haven't already. We're so close to 300, and I'll see you next time. So yeah, in summary, I just want to make it clear that it may not be a big sacrifice for you to pick up and move to another country. It may very well be, but it's not going to necessarily be easy for them. I know some people get the impression that they're single folks hanging out in other countries, that they're just looking forward to having a good relationship, but in many cases these people have big families, and they're an important part of that big family, and that's worth considering. So thank you so much for watching.